Europe lay in ruins. Rome had fallen. The roads were overgrown with grass. The peoples lived in fear and disunity. And suddenly he appeared, a man who towered over others like a giant, whose life was full of mysteries and contradictions. For some he was a warrior, for others a teacher, for a third, a symbol of power. His decisions amazed, his actions surprised, and his name became a legend. This is the story of the one who turned chaos into order, the story of the man who was called the Great. The year 742, Europe, in ruins. Rome had fallen and its laws were forgotten. Robbers rule the roads. Cities stand in a semi-ruined state, and in the north, the Vikings are already preparing their first raids. Amidst this chaos, a boy is born whose life will become a legend. His father is Pepin the Short, the first king of the new Carolingian dynasty. His mother is Bertha, who entered the chronicles under the strange nickname with the large foot. But the memory of his birth was preserved not thanks to his parents, but thanks to him himself. Charles was unusual from the first years of his life. He grew too fast, too tall, too strong. When he was only 15, chroniclers already called him a giant, almost 2 meters in height, in an era when even warriors barely reached 1 meter. 60. He towered over people, as if he had come out of ancient tales. But height and strength were not the only things that distinguished him. The boy had a gaze heavy, piercing, contemporaries wrote. He looked as if he saw a man right through. For knights it was a sign of power, for monks, a sign of chosenness. Charles grew up on the border of 2 worlds. Warriors taught him to wield a sword, monks, the laws of the church. He held both weapons and sacred books with equal confidence. In the morning he trained in the saddle, and in the evening he listened to the reading of Latin texts by torchlight. And it was this duality, strength and faith, war and learning, that made him who he became. But he had a peculiarity. Unlike other kings, Charles passionately loved books, but did not know how to write. His fingers were too rough for a pen. Even as an adult, having already become a ruler, he kept wax tablets under his pillow and at night tried to draw letters. The chronicles have preserved his signatures, uneven, childish, as if made by a schoolboy. The emperor who would build an empire could not fully master the simplest thing, writing. In everyday life, he also was not like other kings. His food was simple: bread, meat on a spit, and a little wine. He did not like feasts and luxury. Contemporaries wrote, he ate like a peasant, although he was the son of a king. Thus began the life of a man who, even in his youth, seemed more than just an heir. His height was frightening. His gaze was mesmerizing. His peculiarities were shocking. And Europe, not yet knowing that dozens of wars and the birth of a new empire awaited it, already felt. The one who would change its destiny had appeared. The year 768. Pepin the Short, the father of Charles, passes away. The kingdom is divided between the 2 sons. Charles and his younger brother Charlemagne become co-rulers, and from that moment all of Europe watches their relationship with anxiety. They were too different. Charles, tall, energetic, self-confident. He was surrounded by warriors. Barons supported his decisions. The people saw strength in him. Charlemagne, the dark opposite. Short, withdrawn, inclined to listen to the advice of monks. He was considered a weak man, but capable of cunning. From the first days of their reign, the alliance was shaky. They sat side by side on the throne, but in their gazes, there was no brotherly affection. The chronicles noted that they had one house, but 2 hearts warring with each other. Every decision turned into a confrontation. When Charles sought campaigns and the expansion of power, Charlemagne insisted on negotiations. When one gathered an army, the other tried to disband it. The kingdom found itself in a state of hidden struggle, not open, but constant. Europe waited to see which of the brothers would prevail. The barons wavered in their support. The people whispered that 2 crowns in one state was an impossibility, that 2 suns cannot shine in the same sky. In the year 771, everything changed. Charlemagne died unexpectedly. It happened suddenly, and the news of his passing shook the kingdom. Almost immediately, rumors spread that Charles had allegedly had a hand in it, striving for sole power. No evidence existed, but the very speed with which these suspicions gripped society shows. People already saw in Charles not just an heir, but a man capable of removing obstacles on his path to the throne. The situation was aggravated by the flight of Charlemagne's widow with her children to Italy, to the Lombards. She feared for her life and for the lives of her children. This step gave Charles a reason for a future military campaign that strengthened his power. Now he remained the sole king of the Franks. Europe for the first time saw in him a figure equal to the ancient emperors. Having become the sole ruler, Charles knew no peace. His life turned into an endless series of campaigns that continued for almost 40 years. The chronicles counted more than 50 of them. Europe had not yet seen a king who spent most of his reign in the saddle. The main trial became the Saxons. This tribe in the north was too freedom-loving, too stubborn to submit. Their lands were covered with forests and swamps, and at the heart of their faith stood sacred temples and idols. Charles saw in them a threat, but also a task, to break their resistance and convert them to Christianity. This confrontation lasted for 30 years. The Saxons rose up again and again, destroying churches and expelling the Franks. Each time Charles returned, built new fortresses, and again baptized the conquered. This was not just an expansion of possessions, it was a struggle of worldviews, in which the sword and the cross went side by side. Charles knew how to combine harshness and cunning. Some he suppressed by force, others he attracted with gifts and lands. Many of the conquered Saxon leaders became his allies and sat at his table. This amazed his contemporaries. Yesterday's enemies, whom he had almost destroyed, the next day became his advisors. In the south, he turned his gaze to Italy. There the Lombards ruled, and it was there that the widow of his brother Charlemagne had fled. For Charles, this was both a matter of honor and a political move. The campaign in Italy ended with him placing the iron crown of the Lombard kings on himself. The Frankish kingdom became an empire, stretching from the north to the Alps. But Charles did not limit himself to this. In Spain, he attempted to advance into the lands where the Arabs ruled. This campaign became unexpectedly difficult. In the Pyrenees Mountains, the Frankish army found itself in a trap. Their part of his army perished, and this episode later became overgrown with legends, from which the famous epic of Roland was born. Charles emerged from these trials stronger. Every campaign, successful or unsuccessful, strengthened his authority. In the eyes of Europe, he was becoming not just a king, but a ruler who controlled the northern tribes, the lands of Italy, and even distant Spain. The chronicles note an amazing fact. Charles could appear in different ends of the empire with incredible speed. He was called the King on the Road, because he spent most of his life on horseback. Contemporaries were amazed at how one man could keep such huge territories under control. The year 800. Rome. On the streets, crowds of pilgrims. In the air, the smell of incense and fire. On this day, Rome looked like the center of the world, and in its heart, people were gathering to see an event that would shake all of Europe. In St. Peter's Basilica, thousands of candles illuminate the dark stone hall. Charles stands there. He is not in gold and purple, but in his usual simple clothes, a woolen tunic and boots. Before him is the altar, and he is praying. As he bows his head, Pope Leo III approaches him with a crown. And at that moment, when the hall falls silent, the crown is placed on Charles's head. The crowd erupts in shouts. The chronicles wrote, "The sky shuddered, and the walls of the temple were filled with voices that proclaimed him emperor." Charles becomes emperor of the Romans. Europe receives a new ruler. The Western Empire, which had fallen more than 300 years ago, seems to be resurrected. But on this day there was another moment which is rarely spoken of. Contemporaries claimed, Charles was angry. He did not want such a scene. He feared that now it would seem as if it was the church that had granted him power. For a proud ruler, this was a blow to his ambitions. An unusual detail. His imperial throne in Aachen, the capital, was made not of gold and ivory, but of rough stone. There were no decorations on it, only cold simplicity. This throne stood in the center of the cathedral and seemed to be a reminder. Charles emphasized strength, not luxury. For the people, it was a day of triumph. For Charles, a day of double meaning. He received a title that had been dreamed of for centuries, but he received it not in the way he wanted. Nevertheless, from that moment, Europe knew. A new emperor had appeared, and his power extended from the Atlantic to the Alps, from the north to Rome. After dozens of campaigns, Europe knew Charles as a man of the sword. But the more his power grew, the more he understood. To hold an empire with victories alone is impossible. To unite different peoples, Charles needed not weapons but knowledge. And then began a project unexpected for everyone, a cultural revival which would later be called the Carolingian Renaissance. Charles turned his capital, Aachen, into the intellectual center of Europe. Scholars from England, Italy, Spain, and Ireland began to flock to his palace. Among them were monks, philosophers, poets, and mathematicians. For the people of that time, this was astonishing. A king who could sit in a library longer than in a banquet hall. Charles passionately loved to listen to readings. Every evening after a meal, he would invite monks and demand that they read ancient texts aloud to him. Sometimes he would interrupt the reading with questions, argue, clarify, contemporaries wrote. He listened to philosophers just as seriously as to generals. Under his patronage, they began to copy old manuscripts. Ancient works that could have been lost forever were preserved precisely thanks to Charles. His orders even concerned the style of writing. A new font was created, the Carolingian minuscule. This neat, clear alphabet became the basis for most European scripts. A detail that strikes the viewer. That is why the modern letters we write with today are the legacy of Charlemagne. In his schools, not only the sons of barons were taught, but also simple, talented children. He demanded that priests be literate and able to read the Bible, not just repeat it from memory. This became a revolution. For the Middle Ages, education was a luxury available to few. The chronicles preserved another curious fact. Despite the fact that Charles did not know how to write beautifully, he always carried with him tablets and a pen. Even on campaigns, he tried to draw letters. The great emperor of Europe and an eternal student. To his contemporaries, this looked like a miracle. A warrior who built libraries. An emperor who created the future not only on the battlefield but also in books. Charles understood. It is impossible to hold an empire by the sword alone. The territories were huge, different peoples had their own customs and traditions. For all of this to work, common rules were needed. And he created them. Charles issued capitularies, special decrees that covered literally everything. They indicated how to collect taxes, how mills should work, how to conduct trade, and even what the weight of bread sold in the markets should be. For his contemporaries, this was incredible. A king who pays attention not only to armies and palaces but also to ensuring that a simple peasant buys honestly measured grain. He personally ensured that the laws were enforced. Charles organized secret inspections, sending special inspectors, missi. They traveled the country and reported directly to him. People knew. Even the most powerful baron could not hide from the emperor's eyes. But along with his strictness, Charles surprised with his habits. An unusual fact, he adored baths. In Aachen, his capital, he built huge thermal baths where hot waters flowed. These were true palaces of water and steam. Charles loved to spend hours there, and not alone. The chronicles claim that he invited dozens of people to the baths at the same time. Advisors, confidants, warriors, even his own children. Sometimes the number of guests reached 100. It was there, in the hot water, that important decisions were made. Charles could discuss the fate of entire provinces while sitting in a bath, as if it were a throne room. For his contemporaries, this looked strange and even shocking. An emperor deciding the affairs of the empire amidst steam and laughter. Another detail, he loved baths so much that even on campaigns he tried to set up primitive baths from cauldrons and wooden tubs. Such he was, a strict ruler, creating a system of laws, and a man who governed an empire not only from a throne but also amidst steam. Outside of campaigns, Charles lived an unexpectedly simple and strange life. He had many children, but he particularly favored his daughters. The emperor categorically forbade them to marry. They all remained at court, accompanied him on trips, and even performed for him with songs. The barons were perplexed. The daughters' marriages could have strengthened alliances, but Charles seemed to deliberately refuse this. Some spoke of jealousy, others of his distrust of the nobility. With his sons, he acted differently. He took them on trips, taught them horse riding, handling weapons, and made them study literacy. For Charles, a future ruler had to possess both the sword and knowledge. Thus, his image combined a stern emperor and a simple father who listened to his daughters singing in the evenings and smiled. Charles entered history as a ruler who subjugated half of Europe. His enemies feared him, his allies respected him. But behind the image of the fearsome warrior was hidden a man who was surprisingly modest in his daily life. The chronicles noted he did not like pomp. His food was simple: meat roasted on a spit, coarse bread, a little wine. Even at celebrations, he avoided exquisite dishes and always preferred the food that peasants ate. The same applied to his clothing. Instead of velvet and gold, he wore woolen tunics and boots. He wore royal jewelry and precious fabrics only on special occasions, and even then reluctantly. Contemporaries wrote that the emperor looked more like a senior warrior than a brilliant monarch. An interesting detail: people recognized Charles not by his clothes or crown, but by his height and gait. He towered over everyone, and even without the imperial signs of power, his figure stood out in any crowd. In this was the paradox of his character. On the battlefield, he was an unyielding commander, and in everyday life, a man who lived almost the same as his subjects. Over the years, Charles's strength began to fade. He was tormented by joint pain, his legs barely obeyed him, but he still mounted his horse and personally managed the affairs of the empire. Even in old age, he remained on the road, as if the road itself were his throne. In his palace in Aachen, everything was a reminder of the greatness of the years he had lived. The giant baths where he held councils, the cathedral he had built himself, and the library where books saved from oblivion were kept. But now he increasingly spent time in his chambers, surrounded by his children and confidants. In the winter of 814, his heart stopped. It happened quietly, without noise, in the capital that he had built and made a symbol of his power. Charles was buried in Aachen Cathedral. His body was placed in a sarcophagus, and the temple itself became a tomb where European rulers came for centuries. A legend exists. When his tomb was opened centuries later, he was found sitting on a throne, with a crown on his head and a sword in his hands, as if he had not departed, but was waiting for his time. This image made him not only an emperor of the past but also an eternal symbol of power. After Charles's passing, his empire could not maintain its former unity. His sons divided the lands, and the vast state gradually broke up into parts. But the idea itself that Europe could be united under one authority remained. Charles became a model for all subsequent monarchs. He was called the emperor whom they strove to emulate. His laws formed the basis for the governance of future kingdoms. His educational reform gave Europe schools, and his cultural revival preserved books that would have otherwise disappeared forever. Even the word king, in many languages, from the German König to the Hungarian Károlyi and the Russian Karol, comes from his name. Charles did not just rule, he became the measure of the very concept of power. He entered history as an emperor who combined the sword and the book, faith and law, severity and simplicity. His life was full of contradictions. A fearsome conqueror and a modest father, a man of simple tastes and the creator of an empire, a ruler who himself could barely write, but saved an entire culture for Europe. Today he is called the father of Europe. But for his contemporaries, he was more than a father. He was a symbol of strength, around which a new world was being built.